The Lassen National Forest is located approximately 130 miles north of Sacramento, California. It is 1,800 square miles, which means if you like remoteness, that would be your location. January 21st of 2000, the middle of winter, a man named Jerry Levitov went fishing around Lake Almoner.
He was going to see if the ice had broken loose into a stream that flows into the lake, but he didn't come home.
His fiancée tries to call him on his cell phone. There's no answer.
And I thought, there's something wrong here. I waited until the next day, and I said, we're going to go look for him.
So they began to mobilize themselves into a search party. They are familiar with his fishing holes in the area.
We went all the way around the lake.
Jerry?
And then finally found his truck on the west shore.
Jerry! Jerry!
He was nowhere.
Jerry!
As they walk up to the truck, they hear a whimpering sound.
Hey, buddy. Where's Daddy, huh?
And our pup, Stormy, was in the back. Jerry loved that pup. And I kept thinking, why didn't he take Stormy with him? I couldn't make sense of anything.
He's not going to abandon a puppy in an unheated pickup truck for 2 days. Now they're terribly frightened. Where is Jerry, and what has happened to him? That's what it takes to be an American detective.
My name is Greg Hagwood. I am a retired sheriff and former investigator with the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. Growing up, my father was good friends with the sheriff. I got the opportunity to tag along. I thought that was a really, really neat job and kind of fell in love with it at the time. And so I got my bachelor's degree in criminal justice. In December of 1988, went to the academy, was a patrol deputy in my hometown. From there, I became the investigation sergeant. Couldn't ask for anything better. It was just the best job in the world. In my time at the sheriff's office, we had about a 100% solve rate on our homicides. That's a reflection of our dedication, our commitment. It leaves you with having a real sense of purpose. It makes you feel good.
Detective Hagwood.
I am made aware that Mr. Levitov's truck is located very near the shores of Lake Almoner. In the wintertime, cold.
Got it.
The greatest danger in January in those mountains, in the wilderness, is hypothermia. You only have a few hours to survive before hypothermia makes you unconscious and you never wake up. When Hagwood arrives on the scene, deputies brief him on the man they're searching for. Jerry Levitov has been missing for 2 days. He is a 26-year employee of the United States Forest Service.
He was very serious and connected to his job. His work life was really important.
He was very athletic and loving to be out and fish. One of the encouragements for him to go into the forestry is that he was out with nature. And eventually, he was signed up in the hotshot crew.
A hotshot crew are firefighters that go back into the deep wilderness with your physical ability only. to cut a fire line to stop a fire.
And they would jump from helicopters and planes into fire.
Smoke jumpers, you go through weeks of training. He really enjoyed that kind of thing.
Very difficult work, physically demanding to the maximum, and dangerous, extremely dangerous.
It's a very critical job. It required a certain aptitude and skills to do that job. Jerry was a highly qualified and experienced firefighter.
What makes this case so interesting is Jerry Levitov would be one of the persons required to search for someone missing in the wilderness. And now it is Jerry that is missing in that same wilderness. This is very ominous, and Hagwood knows it.
Something was very, very wrong about the totality of all these circumstances. For Jerry to go missing, it was just incredibly out of character.
The most common reason someone is missing in this national forest is they get lost. Jerry can't get lost. Not there, because he knows every inch of it.
We've got to figure out what's going on, what happened to Mr. Levitov.
There is freshly fallen snow over this whole area, so everything is obscured. There's no footprints. The area is white.
If you made a scan, you didn't see anything that really looked out of ordinary except for the truck.
Are there signs of a struggle? Hagwood looks inside the cab. He finds nothing out of the ordinary. There's no blood, no evidence of anything. He walks around the other side of the truck and he sees cables hanging from under the hood.
Jumper cables were attached to the battery. It was strange. You naturally start evaluating and you go, okay, somebody's car breakdown, he offers them a jump start.
Hagwood's own experience and his instincts as a policeman are now kicked into high order. This is where this began. This missing person may not be missing. They may be a victim of violence. Something really bad's going on here. Well, if that's where this began, then Jerry Levitov may be very close.
A couple of my officers, they called me over. They said, take a look at that lump in the snow right over there. I looked, and I said, uh-oh.
There are moments in criminal investigations that a bad feeling comes over you. And that's what was going through Hagwood's mind when he saw that lump in the snow. He suspected what that lump was.
I brushed away the snow.
CSI in, please.
It was Jerry Levitov. He had a very catastrophic wound to the head, consistent with a shotgun blast.
Jerry didn't get lost. Jerry didn't die from hypothermia. Jerry wasn't attacked by a bear. Jerry was murdered in the most cold-blooded manner possible. Sergeant Hagwood now realizes he's standing in a crime scene.
We found Jerry Levitov. It appeared that he had been struck with a shotgun blast.
He has a massive gunshot wound to the back of his head. This is close contact. The muzzle of the weapon is placed within 2 inches of the head, and the trigger is pulled. He's been killed execution style and dropped face first, dead to the ground, and covered by the overnight snow.
He doesn't have a wallet. Everybody says he always carries his wallet. So maybe this is a robbery.
Okay, let's say it's a robbery. Then how do you explain the execution-style killing of this individual? Why not just order him to surrender his wallet? There's something very odd about this.
So now we've got a crime scene, but it's covered in snow. So we commandeered some propane torches from the road department. And we undertook the process of melting all the snow.
Now we have a rather confined area to see if any evidence can be located.
We made some discoveries. There was a shotgun shell in close proximity to his vehicle. And then there was a second shotgun shell in very close proximity to Mr. Levitov's remains.
They also find something interesting.
We located a hood emblem from a Honda car where the jumper cables were.
What could have happened here? So is it possible that we have someone with a shotgun who drives a Honda with a weak battery? Yes, it is.
We're entertaining endless ideas. Are we dealing with a set of circumstances that could be related to his employment with the Forest Service?
There are some very dangerous people that are in those woods. And they're there for a reason, to avoid human contact.
Plumas County continues to have a presence of cartel drug activity in terms of large marijuana grows and methamphetamine.
If you do encounter these people in the National Forest, you're dealing with professional criminals. What if Jerry becomes a witness and has to be eliminated? Somebody was here, somebody had a gun, and for some reason decided to take a life. So now the question is open. What caused this to take place?
After we had moved his remains, his girlfriend, Melody, had been there. We let her know that we had located him deceased. The grief and shock, it was very present.
It was like I just couldn't believe. I just felt like I needed to see him, and I never got that chance.
We were all in shock. How could this happen to this nice man who served his country, who loved people? Jerry was born in Pasadena in 1946. He was always interested in the service. So in 1963, he enlisted in the Air Force.
He loved flying. I know in Vietnam, he couldn't talk about much because he worked on some of the radar on the jets that you weren't supposed to know about. He came home real stern.
It was like something changed. He took me aside and he told me, "You don't understand what it was like. 2 days ago, I was sitting in a helicopter with a machine gun, and I had to shoot people I didn't want to shoot." And he wanted to get to a place where he could find a way to really heal. And he headed up north. I think it was a good place for him to be. It is a beautiful place. Forest and streams and lakes and a place to refresh your soul.
Jerry was a consummate wildland firefighter. It really hit home and made me really sad and anxious to find out what happened and bring whoever did this to justice.
An examination of his remains were very preliminary at the scene.
The body is frozen solid like a side of beef in a cooler. You can't move joints, you can't move legs. The technique is to literally allow it to thaw.
The autopsy confirmed that the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head.
Are there any other injuries? Any other evidence of torture or defensive wounds or anything like that?
Mr. Levitov had what appeared to be a very, very close-range shotgun wound through his hand.
Well, this is odd. Did the pain of that injury cause him to fall?
The working theory was he was running away from the truck. He had put his hand up to shield his face. Got shot. The grazing wound knocked him down.
The shooter puts the muzzle to the back of the victim's head
and basically executed him right there.
This crime is beyond weird. To kill with that level of violence and that amount of coldness, there's more to this than the theft of a wallet.
You naturally start looking at the circumstances, the evidence, the scene, the location, the individual. You need to try to understand as much as you possibly can about the person that was the victim.
There was a phone call from Hagwood and told me they would be coming to question me.
Talking with Melody, it seemed Jerry Levitov was a much-loved, very liked person.
He was just really kind and he was funny. He was really loving. He had a sparkle in his eyes. It was magic.
At this juncture in Jerry Levitov's life, he had been separated and going through a divorce process with his former wife.
Interesting.
You want to go back and reverse engineer in time and place and people everything that they were doing. When was the last time you saw Mr. Levitov? What was he doing?
He was going to Lake Almanor.
So who would have done this?
I don't know. He was well liked. He didn't have enemies.
There is absolutely no evidence to support that anybody out there has any reason to do him harm. So what do? Well, let's search the place. Maybe there's something there that can give us somewhere to go next, because right now we don't have a place to go.
And you have unfettered access to a person's house. You can start to understand their habits.
It is a bizarre thing to search the belongings of a dead person. You feel sometimes like you're violating their grave, but you're not doing it for that reason. You're trying to find out who did them harm.
We discovered Jerry did have a life insurance policy.
And the beneficiary of said policy is not his live-in girlfriend. It's none of his siblings. It's his ex-wife. Now that raises a red flag. You're the ex-wife, and yet you're entitled to all this money if Jerry winds up dead. Well, you have obviously thousands of reasons to see Jerry dead because you're going to benefit by this policy. And it's obvious that somebody really wanted him that way. Sometimes, in the cases of divorce, you have simmering emotion after the fact, and a level of hatred begins to build. Does it build far enough to kill? We need to find out. So the first stop is the ex-wife.
At this juncture in Jerry Levitov's life, he had been separated and going through a divorce process with his estranged wife, Chris Levitov.
I just remembered telling my daughter, well, the sheriffs are going to come over to ask questions about Jerry. And he was very close to my daughter. So I made her go into the bedroom because I wasn't sure what they were going to talk about.
You found this while we were searching this house.
And I do remember them asking me if I knew who he left his life insurance to. I was very surprised.
learned this?
And I said, no.
She never knew that a policy existed. He apparently never told her.
She wasn't even aware of that and didn't seem even remotely interested.
It wasn't like it was a bad, devastating breakup or anything. We got along just fine. He would still come over and sit by the campfire and visit my daughter. He was a good guy. We all love and miss him. He didn't deserve that. There's absolutely no reason why somebody would want to kill him.
She is totally shocked, and Hagwood is experienced enough to know that all of those emotions and expressions from her are absolutely appropriate.
One of the aspects that was very important and had to be addressed in a very timely manner was his wallet is gone. Given the absence of his wallet and the credit cards the next day at the sheriff's office, I pick up the phone and I just start calling these credit card companies. I've got to see if there's been any activity on this.
Hello, this is Detective Greg Hagwood.
When you have someone engaged in such a brutal act of senseless violence against apparently one of the nicest guys in the world, you've got to kick it into the next gear.
Gerald or Jerry?
I explain to them who I am, what I'm doing.
Hello, this is Detective Greg Hagwood.
Bingo. Landed on the right credit card.
Now we have something we can chase.
Let's get a look and see if there's been any activity since he's been reported missing.
They provide a date and a time that is after the date and time of Jerry's death. So wherever that card was used, it was most likely used by the person who killed Jerry.
One of the initial purchases that our suspect had made with our victim's credit card was at a car part store in Elko, Nevada.
He bought a car battery. Leads right back to those jumper cables. Here's a guy that needs a battery, and he's willing to kill for it. This is him.
The credit card use, it's sequentially marching across the state of Nevada and then into Utah.
It looks like our shooter is eastbound and down.
I'm on the phone with a credit card representative. He goes, holy smokes, that credit card's being used right now at a gas station in Flaming Gorge, Utah. Well, I'm awake now. That's a huge sense of urgency when you know your bad guy at that moment in time are at this address, engaged in this behavior, making this purchase.
There is a moment in every case when the smoke will clear and you get this distinct feeling in you that we're onto something here.
I very quickly identified the law enforcement agencies that have jurisdiction, and the information I'm trying to blast out to them as rapidly as I can is be on the lookout for anybody in possession of these credit cards.
So our shooter, was at this gas station at 3 o'clock in the morning, and Hagwood is 3 states away. He'd like to close that gap instantly, but instantly isn't going to happen.
So I called my sergeant, told him to get a backpack and get down here to the office. We have to go to Utah right now.
Sergeant Greg Hagwood is a man of perseverance. He's a homicide detective. He won't stop. He won't give up. He won't do anything until he has his hands around the throat of who killed Jerry Levitoff.
So my sergeant arrived, and we drove from Quincy to Reno, Nevada, which is the closest airport. And we flew to Salt Lake City, rented a car. We're setting the land speed record.
And they hammer that car at 100 miles an hour plus until they reach Flaming Gorge, Utah.
We went to the truck stop where Mr. Levitoff's credit card was used. We start talking and interviewing staff.
While the midnight clerk is still on duty. They asked, do you remember this particular transaction?
They said, yeah, I think I remember.
There was that guy and another guy was with him. Another guy?
Okay. Wow, we may have another suspect.
They look at the surveillance tape, and there is a clear image of a disheveled-looking person, as if he is a kind of person that lives in the woods. And the other guy is an average guy, a little older maybe than this first guy. They paid separately.
Thank you. Hey, Tagwood.
So they run those credit cards. And the other person's name is Greg Cook.
Now we're going to want to get to know him a little bit, so you're going to run a criminal history on him and run a credit check. And lo and behold, that individual had been arrested for a charge of drunk and disorderly conduct in Plumas County many years earlier and had been booked into the Plumas County Jail.
Plumas County, California is where our victim was killed. 800 miles and 3 states away from this gas station. Is that a coincidence? No one in the homicide business believes in a coincidence.
Well, there's our connection to Plumas County, right?
Now our man is in the same gas station with the shooter using the victim's credit card. He's got to be part of this. He's got to be a suspect in a homicide. It turns out that Greg Cook has an address on file. He's from Wyoming, 10 minutes north of Flaming Gorge, Utah, and he's not hard to find.
Hi there.
You, Greg Cook?
Yes, sir.
They ask him what happened in the gas station. He was struck by the confusion. What do you mean? Well, you were in the store with another guy.
It was just me and this guy talking. That's it.
Cook informs these officers that he is a chatty person. He bumped into this guy in this gas station at 3 o'clock in the morning. He struck up a conversation with him. Nothing more than that. Didn't know him from Adam.
He had no idea who this person is.
Even though he doesn't have an alibi, he doesn't have a real way to prove anything, what he says makes perfect sense. He's somewhat of a vagabond who wanders around and talks to perfect strangers. Lots of people do that.
Thank you for your time.
We went back and we double-checked the videotape. As it turned out, this other guy had absolutely no affiliation, connection, or anything to do with our case. We were about that far from taking this person into custody, but you dot your I's and you cross your T's.
Hagwood.
Hagwood gets a phone call about the APB he put out.
It was one of my partners. He goes, hey, Fish and Wildlife officer up at Flaming Gorge, Utah. They've made an arrest.
The Forest Service officer tells Hagwood on the phone he and a fish and game warden responded to a report of illegal fishing.
You have a fishing license with you out here fishing?
So this Fish and Wildlife officer encounters this guy in violation of some fishing regulations.
They're looking at this kid, writing him his ticket. The officer looks in the window of the car and sees credit cards on the dash.
And the Fish and Wildlife officer says, holy smokes.
On the credit card, he sees Gerald Levitoff.
Put your hands on the hood right now. Put your hands on the hood. Do it.
He takes this individual down at gunpoint.
Now Hagwood feels so good. This is the guy.
A young man named Rain Dancer Dickie O'Brien.
This guy's wanted for murder, but his crime is fishing without a fishing license. Little things can catch up to you.
We went to the Daggett County Jail. Sat down across the table from this Rain Dancer Dickie O'Brien. He looked disheveled, unkempt, did not have what you would call a healthy glow. There just didn't seem to be a whole lot there. You look into their eyes and, you're coming up zeros And personally and professionally, I wanted to know. I wanted him to tell me what he did, why he did it, what was going through his mind.
Why would anybody kill this forest worker in the most brutal manner possible over a misdemeanor theft of a wallet and credit cards?
I have in the past enjoyed a tremendous measure of success getting people to tell me what they did.
You have the right to remain silent.
And I read him his rights.
You understand your rights. I want a lawyer.
He decided he did not want to make a statement. And that was really, really disappointing. And so I kind of felt a sense of personal defeat that rain dancer Dickie O'Brien wouldn't talk to me.
That's always frustrating, but often it's also common. Confessions are very rare, and everybody wants a lawyer. That's the way it is. Hagwood is faced with the ultimate problem.
If you don't have a confession or an incriminating statement from your suspect, you better have compelling evidence. And in this case, we did not.
The only evidence that Dickie O'Brien has in his possession that makes him arrestable in this case are the victim's credit cards. Does that constitute a murder case? It does not. If they don't find something else, they're going to have to turn loose Mr. Dickie O'Brien and let him pay his fishing ticket and move on with his life. Being in possession of a homicide victim's credit cards is, of course, enormously suspicious. But rain dancer Dickie O'Brien, he can explain that away in a courtroom.
You can leave no stone unturned. Failure is not an option.
Hagwood presents his information to a Utah judge, and the judge signs a search warrant for the car.
So we went to the arrest site, to the campground. When I arrived, I'll never forget talking to the officer up there. And I said, he's driving a Honda, isn't he? And he goes, yeah. I go to the front. And tell me it's missing the hood emblem. And he, how'd you know that? I go, I've got it.
So, check one on this list. Clear and convincing. He opens the trunk, and concealed inside is a 12-gauge sawed-off shotgun.
We've got very compelling evidence that this is, in fact, our guy. We spent a day long processing his camp. We had the sawed-off shotgun. We had matching ammunition. We had the items that he purchased with Jerry's cards. And his car had a brand new battery.
2 and 2 equals 4. Or in this case, 2 and 2 equals Dickie O'Brien.
Rain dancer Dickie O'Brien was sent to Atascadero State Penitentiary, which is a medical facility in Central California, where they treated him in an effort to bring him to a level of competency to stand trial.
He has a history of mental illness. Dickie O'Brien was diagnosed as being bipolar and has been taking antipsychotic medication for years.
And after a lengthy period of time, Atascadero said, hey, he's competent now to stand trial.
In order to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, you've got to show some demonstration of how insane you actually probably are. So he had to explain what he was doing when he shot this man. And he explained, he is in the woods. It turns out that Dickie O'Brien, in the past several months, ran out of money completely, so he stopped buying his medication. So he is spiraling into psychosis. And he explained that he has voices in his head, and the voices told him that the government was out to get him, and they were surveilling him constantly, and eventually they were going to kill him. The voices also tell him he should stay in the woods, away from people and away from any sort of technology, and he selects the woods where our victim likes to go fishing.
Rain dancer Dickie O'Brien had been driving kind of aimlessly into the next morning, and he ended up at Lake Almanor.
And his battery dies in his car because, of course, he's broke and he can't afford to fix it. Along comes a man in a pickup truck.
Hey, can I help you?
If you got any battery cables, you need to jump. I have cables. And he goes into his truck and he gets his cables.
Jerry, in an act of good citizenry and just kindness, created this encounter with a psychotic, homicidal person.
What are you doing all the way out here? Oh, the Forestry Service.
And he explains he's on his off time and he's going to fish today. But he identifies himself as a federal employee. In the twisted brain of our man Dickie O'Brien, this is a CIA assassin. He pulls out his shotgun and says, "Stand over there by that tree so I can kill you."
Hey, man. Oh, man.
Move.
I didn't do anything. Hey, take my money.
Now, go.
Here, take it. Take it.
Jerry Levitoff threw his wallet at him.
Our man opens fire. The first blast hits him in the left hand and knocks him down. He puts the muzzle to the back of his head.
Mr. Rain Dancer Dickie O'Brien, having just committed the most brutal homicide, probably slammed the hood down with a measure of enthusiasm that caused the hood ornament to break off.
Which wound up at the scene, along with the 2 expended casings from his shotgun. Jerry Levitoff is alone, covered by the overnight snow. The courts determined that rain dancer Dickie O'Brien was in fact mentally ill, but not insane, in the sense that he understood what he was doing to the victim, Jerry Levitoff.
Eventually, he pled guilty. He's been sentenced to life without parole.
Jerry was so well known in the community and so well connected. I asked the family if we could do a fireman's funeral, and they said yes. The whole community was there. I presented the family with the flag. Everyone thought that was probably the perfect thing for Jerry, and he deserved it, so we did it.
We got his ashes, and the family and I went down in the water to Lake Almanor, which we both loved, and released the ashes.
He loved the outdoors. He loved his life. Why he was taken away, I don't know. I don't know.
Some people's tanks are filled to the top and they've got a good measure of life, and Dickie O'Brien's tank was empty. There just wasn't anything there. And that might help explain a willingness to engage in such horrific behavior.
Dickie O'Brien stands out from all the others in one simple way. His lunacy overtook him, and he became violent and exceedingly dangerous. Hagwood was able to stop the pattern. Because Detective Sergeant Hagwood was relentless, which is what homicide detectives need to be, until they have the person responsible where they want him, which is standing in front of a judge. Next time on American Detective.
Even before I walked up to the pile, you could just smell that smell.
It looked like something you would see in a horror film.
Nobody's gonna mess with Bonnie without Clyde coming and handle it.
If you think this is going to end well, you're sorely mistaken.
The phone rang at 2:17 a.m., slicing through the silence of a frozen Chicago night, and in that single, shattering moment, everything that followed would stretch across 3 decades, leaving a scar on a city that would never fully heal. A woman's voice trembled on the line, fractured by panic, breathless, barely coherent, repeating one word like a prayer and a warning all at once: missing. By dawn, the streets were sealed. Squad cars lined the curb in an unbroken chain of flashing red and blue, and the first whispers of what would become one of Chicago's most haunting cold cases began to spread through the neighborhood like a slow-moving fog. The apartment sat on the 3rd floor of a worn brick building on the city's west side, a place where cracked sidewalks and flickering streetlights blended into the background noise of everyday survival. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and winter coats damp from melting snow. A table stood half set for dinner. 2 plates, 2 forks, 1 chair pulled back, abandoned mid-motion. The clock on the wall had stopped at 9:42 p.m., its ticking silenced, as if time itself had flinched. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no overturned furniture, just absence. A clean, terrifying absence that suggested someone had left willingly or had been taken without a sound. Her name was Elena Morales, 26 years old, a medical student, known for her meticulous habits, her punctuality, her near-obsessive sense of responsibility. She never missed a shift, never ignored a call, never vanished. Friends described her as cautious to the point of anxiety. Family members insisted she would never simply walk away. Yet here they were, standing in her empty apartment, staring at a life interrupted mid-sentence. Police moved quickly. Patrol officers canvassed the block before sunrise, knocking on doors, waking up groggy residents, flashing badges into tired eyes. A retired factory worker across the hall reported hearing footsteps in the hallway around 10, nothing unusual. A couple downstairs mentioned the low rumble of a car engine idling longer than normal. Another neighbor recalled seeing a dark sedan parked near the entrance, windows tinted, license plate unreadable in the gloom. None of it formed a clear picture. None of it pointed anywhere solid. By noon, detectives arrived, and the tone shifted from concern to urgency. This was no longer a routine missing persons case. This felt wrong. In Elena's bedroom, they found her purse on the dresser, wallet inside, cash untouched. Her winter coat still hung by the door. Her car remained parked outside, dusted with fresh snow. On the kitchen counter, a half-written note lay crumpled beside a stack of textbooks. It listed groceries: milk, eggs, bread, coffee. Normal. Painfully normal. There were no goodbye messages. No cryptic warnings. No explanation. The last confirmed sighting placed her alive at 9:18 p.m., captured by a grainy security camera at the corner store 2 blocks away. The footage showed her paying for a newspaper, tucking it under her arm, and stepping back into the cold, her breath visible in the glow of the streetlight. She glanced once over her shoulder, as if sensing something, then disappeared into the darkness. By nightfall, her face was on every television screen in the city. Reporters clustered outside the building, microphones thrust forward, voices competing for sound bites. Mysterious disappearance. Bright young woman vanishes without a trace. Community in shock. Flyers went up on telephone poles. Her family stood before cameras, eyes hollow, pleading for anyone who knew anything to come forward. Tips flooded the hotline. Hundreds. Thousands. Most went nowhere. Some contradicted each other. A few hinted at darker possibilities. One anonymous caller claimed to have seen Elena arguing with a man near her building that night, his face hidden beneath a baseball cap. Another suggested she had been followed from the subway. A third insisted she had mentioned feeling watched in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Detectives sifted through each lead, mapping movements, checking alibis, tracing phone records. They interviewed classmates, professors, co-workers, ex-boyfriends. Every connection was dissected, every conversation replayed. Yet the puzzle refused to assemble. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Winter surrendered to spring, and still there was no sign of Elena Morales. No body. No ransom demand. No credible sightings. Just the growing weight of uncertainty pressing down on her family and the investigators tasked with finding her. The case file thickened, bursting with notes, photographs, transcripts, diagrams. But answers remained elusive, slipping just beyond reach. Then, in late April, a fisherman along the Des Plaines River discovered something caught in the reeds near a bend downstream from the city. A dark coat, waterlogged, heavy with mud. Inside the pocket, a scrap of paper, barely legible. A grocery list. Milk, eggs, bread, coffee. The same items written in Elena's careful handwriting. The discovery ignited a frenzy. Search teams descended on the riverbanks. Divers combed the murky depths. Helicopters circled overhead. News vans returned, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. But the river surrendered nothing else. No remains. No personal belongings. Just silence, deep and impenetrable. The coat raised more questions than it answered. Had she gone into the river? Had someone planted it there to mislead investigators? Was it a final trace, or a deliberate deception? The current in that stretch of water was slow. If a body had entered nearby, it should have surfaced. It never did. Theories multiplied, each darker than the last. Abduction, human trafficking, organized crime, a crime of passion. Each possibility branched into a dozen more, a labyrinth with no exit. As the first anniversary approached, public interest began to wane. New tragedies replaced old headlines. The case slipped from front-page news to a file gathering dust in the homicide unit. But for Elena's family, time stood still. Her mother kept her room exactly as it had been, textbooks stacked neatly, bed made tight. Her father walked the same routes she used to take, scanning crowds for a familiar silhouette. Every unidentified body found in the city triggered a fresh wave of dread. Every phone call after midnight reopened the wound. Detectives refused to let the case die. They revisited the evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, scrutinized the grainy footage frame by frame. They noticed small details previously overlooked, a shadow crossing the sidewalk just before Elena exited the corner store, a faint reflection in a car window, the echo of footsteps trailing her down the block. None of it was definitive. All of it hinted at something lurking just outside the frame. A break came unexpectedly in 1994 when a man arrested for an unrelated assault claimed knowledge of Elena's disappearance. In a taped interrogation, he described a late-night encounter, a woman matching her description, a struggle, a vehicle. His story was vivid, chilling, and completely false. He later admitted fabricating it in hopes of securing a lighter sentence. The false confession poisoned the investigation, diverting resources, clouding timelines, eroding trust. When it collapsed, it left behind only exhaustion and frustration. Years passed. Leads dried up. Witnesses moved away or died. Memories faded. The case became a ghost, haunting the precinct, whispered about in late-night shifts and training seminars. It was labeled a cold case, a term that sounded clinical but carried the weight of unfinished grief. Yet somewhere in the archives, in boxes sealed and shelved, the truth waited, patient, relentless. In 2002, advances in forensic science, offered a fragile glimmer of hope. The coat recovered from the river was re-examined using newly developed DNA techniques. Trace fibers were isolated. A partial genetic profile emerged, belonging to an unknown male. It did not match any records in existing databases. Still, it was something. A fragment of a presence, a fingerprint of guilt. The profile was uploaded, flagged, and left to wait in digital limbo, a silent sentinel scanning millions of identities. Another decade slipped by.
Chicago changed.
Skyscrapers rose. Neighborhoods transformed. Technology rewrote the rhythms of daily life. But the Morales family remained frozen in 1992, tethered to a moment that refused to release them. Birthdays were marked by empty chairs. Holidays passed under the shadow of absence. Hope became a cautious, painful thing, rationed in small doses. Then, in 2019, a detective named Aaron Keller reopened the file. Newly assigned to the cold case unit, Keller approached the investigation with fresh eyes and a relentless patience honed over years of chasing vanishing truths. He immersed himself in the case, reading every report, listening to every tape, reconstructing the final hours of Elena's life minute by minute. Patterns began to surface. A series of unsolved assaults in the early 1990s. Similar locations. Similar methods. Victims approached late at night, coerced into vehicles, vanished for hours, sometimes days, before reappearing traumatized and silent. One detail recurred with unsettling consistency: a dark sedan, windows tinted, idling too long at the curb. Keller traced the vehicle descriptions through old traffic citations, abandoned reports, and forgotten surveillance logs. The trail was faint, fragmented, but persistent. It led him to a name that had appeared only once in the original investigation, buried in a stack of dismissed leads: Marcus Reed, a delivery driver with a minor criminal record, questioned briefly in 1992 and released. At the time, there had been nothing concrete tying him to the disappearance. Now, 3 decades later, his DNA was on file due to a recent conviction for a nonviolent offense. When the match came back, it was immediate. The partial profile from the code. A perfect alignment. After 30 years, the genetic echo left behind in the reeds along the Des Plaines River finally had a voice. Detectives moved quickly, assembling warrants, retracing Reed's history, uncovering a trail of relocations, aliases, and sealed records. The quiet, unremarkable life he had built concealed a past steeped in shadow. On a gray morning in early February, officers surrounded a modest suburban home, their breath fogging in the cold air as they waited for the signal. Inside, a man in his late 50s sat at a kitchen table, sipping coffee, unaware that the walls were about to close in. When the door burst open and his name was shouted, decades collapsed into a single, inescapable moment. The arrest was swift. The charges, devastating. And as the news broke, Chicago held its breath, bracing for the revelation still to come, knowing that beneath the weight of years, the truth had finally begun to stir. Interrogation Room B was windowless, its pale walls humming faintly beneath the fluorescent lights, the air heavy with the smell of disinfectant and old paper, and when Marcus Reed was led inside in handcuffs, the weight of 30 years pressed down on his shoulders like a physical force. He did not resist. He did not speak. He simply stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on a point no one else could see, as if the ghosts of 1992 were already standing there, waiting. The tape recorder clicked on, a sound sharp enough to slice the silence, and in that instant, a cold case that had haunted Chicago for 3 decades stepped back into the light, trembling, raw, and dangerously alive. Detective Aaron Keller sat across from him, a thick file resting on the metal table between them, its edges worn soft by countless hands. Inside were photographs, witness statements, forensic reports, maps, timelines, fragments of lives frozen mid-motion. Keller spoke calmly, deliberately, each word measured, as if any sudden movement might cause the fragile structure of the moment to collapse. He began not with accusations, but with time, with distance, with the strange mercy of years that dulls fear and sharpens regret. He talked about memory, about how it corrodes and reforms, about how even the most carefully buried truths have a way of clawing back to the surface. Reed listened in silence, his breathing slow, his expression unreadable. The first question was simple. Where were you on the night of February 12th, 1992? Reed's lips tightened. His eyes flickered. For a second, the mask slipped, revealing something dark and restless beneath. He claimed he could not remember. 30 years was a long time, he said. Too long to recall specific nights. Keller slid a photograph across the table, a grainy still from a traffic camera 2 blocks from Elena Morales' apartment, time-stamped 9:30, 6 p.m. A dark sedan waited at the curb, headlights off, engine idling. The license plate was blurred, but a distinctive dent marred the rear bumper. Reed owned that car in 1992. He had reported it stolen later that year. Insurance records confirmed the claim. The vehicle was never recovered. Reed swallowed. He shifted in his chair. Still, he said nothing. Keller pressed on, laying out the pattern that had emerged from the wreckage of forgotten police reports. The assaults. The abductions. The survivors who described the same method, the same coercion, the same suffocating fear. The dark sedan. The voice in the shadows. The smell of gasoline and cheap cologne. Reed's face paled. A bead of sweat traced a slow path down his temple. He muttered that coincidences happened, that Chicago was full of dark sedans, that memories could be manipulated. Keller did not argue. He simply placed the DNA report on the table, the sterile language of science delivering its verdict with brutal clarity. The room seemed to shrink. The genetic material recovered from the coat. A partial profile preserved through decades of technological evolution. A perfect match to Reed. Probability of coincidence. 1 in several billion. For the first time, Reed's composure fractured. His breath hitched. His fingers trembled against the tabletop. The years he had spent outrunning that moment collapsed into a single, suffocating second. He stared at the paper as though it were a death sentence. But still, he did not confess. Hours passed. The lights buzzed. The tape rolled. Keller offered water, a sandwich, a chance to step outside. Reed declined. He remained trapped in a silent standoff with the past, caught between the instinct to deny and the crushing inevitability of exposure. Finally, near dawn, he spoke. He said he had seen Elena that night. He said it had been an accident. He said things had gotten out of hand. His voice was flat, drained of emotion, as if recounting a story that no longer belonged to him. He described following her from the corner store, drawn by impulse and opportunity, telling himself it was harmless, that he only wanted to talk. He said he approached her near her building, introduced himself, claimed his car had broken down, and asked for help. She hesitated. She stepped back. She sensed the danger before it fully revealed itself. Panic surged. He grabbed her arm. She screamed. The sound was swallowed by the city's noise, by the distance between windows, by the indifference of late-night streets. He forced her into the car. Keller listened, his jaw clenched, his pen unmoving above the notepad. Every word felt like an intrusion into sacred ground, a violation of the fragile space where Elena's memory still lived. Reed's account shifted, details blurring, timelines warping. He said she struggled. He said she tried to escape. He said he drove for hours, directionless, consumed by fear and adrenaline. He claimed she was alive when they reached the river. He claimed she ran. He claimed he never touched her again. But when pressed, when the inconsistencies were exposed, his story unraveled, revealing gaps large enough to swallow entire truths. Where did she go?
Keller asked.
Reed stared at the wall. His silence answered. Search teams returned to the Des Plaines River, armed with modern sonar, drones, and forensic mapping tools unavailable in the early 90s. The water was colder now, darker, its currents reshaped by decades of erosion and construction. Divers descended into the depths, scanning the riverbed for anomalies. They found rusted bicycles, discarded safes, the skeletal remains of animals. They did not find Elena. If her body had ever been there, the river had claimed it long ago, scattering the fragments of her existence beyond recovery. The absence of remains complicated everything. Without a body, the prosecution faced an uphill battle. Confessions could be recanted, memories challenged, evidence questioned. Defense attorneys circled, preparing to dismantle the case piece by piece. Reed's legal team argued contamination, chain of custody failures, the unreliability of decades-old DNA samples. They pointed to the lack of physical proof of death. They demanded reasonable doubt. And doubt, after 30 years, was abundant. Yet the case was no longer built on a single pillar. It rested on a lattice of connections, patterns, and probabilities that, when viewed together, formed a grim mosaic. Keller uncovered records showing Reed had been fired from multiple delivery jobs for inappropriate behavior. Former coworkers recalled his volatile temper, his obsessive grudges, his habit of lingering outside women's homes. One woman came forward to describe a night in 1991 when a man matching Reed's description forced her into a car, drove her aimlessly through industrial neighborhoods, and released her hours later, shaken but alive. She had been too afraid to report it at the time. Now, her testimony added another thread to the tightening net. As the story broke, the city reacted with a mixture of relief and disbelief. For 30 years, Elena Morales had been a ghost, a symbol of unresolved fear. Now, her name dominated headlines once more, accompanied by the word solved, a term that felt both triumphant and hollow. Candlelight vigils returned to the sidewalks outside her old building. Strangers left flowers, notes, photographs. Her family emerged from the long shadow of uncertainty to face a new, brutal reality. There would be no reunion, no miracle, only a courtroom, a verdict, and the slow, painful work of grief. Her mother stood before reporters, her voice steady but strained, thanking investigators for their persistence, for refusing to let her daughter become a statistic. Her father said nothing, his eyes fixed on the pavement, his hands clenched around a faded photograph. In private, the family wrestled with a storm of emotions: anger at the man who had stolen Elena's future, frustration at the years lost to silence, and a fragile, complicated gratitude for finally knowing the truth. Reed was transferred to county jail under heavy guard. Other inmates recognized his name, the headlines that clung to him like a second skin. Whispers followed him down the corridors. Cold case killer. River ghost. He kept to himself, retreating into a cocoon of isolation, his nights haunted by memories he could no longer outrun. In the darkness of his cell, the echoes of that winter night returned, unfiltered, relentless. Prosecutors prepared their case with meticulous care, aware that any misstep could unravel years of work. They reconstructed the timeline, mapped Reed's movements, correlated phone records, employment logs, and witness statements. Each piece, insignificant on its own, gained weight in collective alignment. The narrative that emerged was one of opportunity seized by violence, of a predator exploiting the thin spaces between ordinary moments. Yet unanswered questions lingered, casting long shadows across the proceedings. Why Elena? Was she targeted, or merely in the wrong place at the wrong time? Had Reed acted alone, or had someone else been involved? Were there other victims who never came forward, their stories swallowed by fear and time? Each question hovered, unanswered, over the fragile architecture of justice. As the trial date approached, the defense signaled its strategy: cast doubt, fracture certainty, resurrect alternative theories long dismissed. They resurrected the false confession of 1994, the anonymous tips, the rumors of organized crime involvement. They argued that the coat could have been planted, that the DNA sample could have been transferred, that memory itself was a treacherous witness. The courtroom braced for a battle that would test not only the evidence, but the endurance of everyone who had carried this case for 3 decades. In the weeks before jury selection, Keller returned to the river one last time. He stood on the bank where the coat had been found, watching the dark water slide past in silence. Snow drifted down, dissolving into the current, vanishing without trace. He thought of Elena, of the life she might have lived, the patients she might have healed, the family she might have built. He thought of the countless nights her parents had spent waiting for a phone call that never came. And he wondered whether closure was truly possible, or whether some wounds remained open by their very nature. The city waited. The courtroom lights burned late into the night. And in the quiet spaces between headlines and hearings, a deeper truth took shape, that even when a cold case is declared solved, the echoes of what was lost continue to reverberate, long after the verdict is read, long after the doors close, long after justice, in its imperfect human form, has spoken. The courtroom filled before sunrise, its wooden benches creaking beneath the slow weight of bodies settling in, the low murmur of anticipation rolling through the chamber like distant thunder, and when Marcus Reed was led in through the side door, shackled, pale, and hollow-eyed, every whisper collapsed into a suffocating silence. This was the moment Chicago had waited for. 30 years of unanswered questions, restless nights, and unresolved fear had converged here, inside for walls heavy with history and consequence. Outside, news vans lined the street, satellite dishes pointed skyward, feeding the hunger of a city desperate to finally understand what had happened on a cold winter night in 1992. The prosecution opened with a single sentence, delivered slowly, deliberately, as if carving it into stone. Elena Morales left her apartment alive, and she never came home. From there, the narrative unfolded like a tightening vice, each detail compressing the air until breathing itself felt like an effort. Jurors were taken back in time, step by step, minute by minute, retracing her final hours. They saw the grainy footage from the corner store. They heard the soft rustle of her coat as she tucked the newspaper under her arm. They listened to the scratch of her pen on the grocery list. Each ordinary gesture became unbearable, transformed into a farewell no one knew was happening. Witness after witness took the stand. Neighbors described the night in fragments: the distant sound of a car engine, the echo of hurried footsteps, a muffled cry swallowed by the city's relentless noise. A forensic analyst explained the DNA match, translating complex science into stark inevitability. Charts glowed on overhead screens, illustrating probabilities so small they bordered on the impossible. The numbers left little room for doubt. Yet the defense fought back with equal intensity, their voices sharp, their objections relentless, determined to pry open any crack in the foundation of the case. They questioned the integrity of the evidence, highlighting the decades that had passed, the countless hands that had touched the coat, the storage rooms, the laboratory benches. They suggested contamination, transfer, coincidence. They attacked the reliability of memory, the malleability of recollection under pressure. They resurrected old theories, paraded long-dismissed suspects through the courtroom like specters, and painted a portrait of uncertainty vast enough to swallow the truth whole. Each argument struck at the fragile bridge between suspicion and certainty, threatening to send justice tumbling into the abyss of doubt. Reed himself remained mostly silent, his face a mask of strained composure, eyes darting between jurors and witnesses, absorbing every word. When he did testify, his voice was subdued, almost apologetic, as he recounted a version of events stripped of violence, a story in which fear and confusion replaced intent. He claimed he had panicked, that he had let Elena go, that he had never harmed her. He spoke of nightmares, of guilt, of decades haunted by a moment he wished he could erase. Some jurors leaned forward, searching his face for sincerity. Others stared through him, unmoved. The prosecution countered with chilling precision. They presented the testimony of survivors, women who had carried their own silent traumas for years, now stepping into the light to speak of encounters that mirrored Elena's disappearance in haunting detail. They described the dark sedan, the coercion, the terror, the way the city blurred past their windows as they begged to be released. Their voices trembled, but they did not break. The courtroom listened, suspended in a collective breath, as the pattern revealed itself, not a single, isolated tragedy, but a thread woven through time, connecting fear to opportunity, silence to survival. Days stretched into weeks. The trial consumed the city, dominating conversations in cafes, offices, classrooms. Every development sparked debate. Every testimony reignited old wounds. For Elena's family, each session was an exercise in endurance, their faces etched with exhaustion and fragile hope. Her mother clutched a rosary, fingers moving in constant, silent prayer. Her father stared straight ahead, as if looking beyond the walls, beyond the years, to a place where his daughter still lived. In the final arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to see the case not as fragments scattered across decades, but as a single, continuous narrative.
A man.
A pattern. A night. A disappearance. A river. A trace of DNA left behind like a whispered confession. They spoke of responsibility, of the weight of evidence, of the duty to give voice to a woman who had been silenced. The defense responded with an appeal to doubt, reminding jurors that certainty was a dangerous illusion, that the absence of a body meant the absence of proof, that life, in all its unpredictability, could still harbor unseen explanations. The jury retired in silence. For 3 days, the city waited. Inside the deliberation room, 12 strangers sifted through 30 years of history, wrestling with doubt and conviction, fear and duty. They examined photographs, reread transcripts, replayed recordings. They argued. They questioned. They weighed probabilities against possibilities. Each decision felt irreversible, each conclusion burdened with consequence. Outside, reporters speculated, families waited, and the past hovered like a restless spirit, unwilling to be dismissed. When the verdict finally came, it arrived not with thunder, but with a hushed, collective intake of breath.
Guilty.
On all counts. The word reverberated through the courtroom, bouncing off wood and stone, settling heavily in the air. Elena's mother collapsed into tears, her shoulders shaking as decades of suspended grief finally found release. Her father closed his eyes, exhaling a breath he had been holding for 30 years. Around them, strangers wept, united by the fragile relief of resolution. Reed stood motionless, his face drained of color, as if the life had been siphoned from his veins.
He did not speak.
He did not react. Only his hands trembled, betraying the storm beneath the surface. Sentencing was scheduled for a later date, but the damage was done. The narrative of his life had been rewritten in a single word, etched permanently into the public record. Yet even in victory, the shadows persisted. Without physical remains, questions lingered like unresolved chords. Where was Elena? Had the river truly claimed her, or had she been hidden elsewhere, beyond reach, beyond recovery? Did Reed's confession, fractured and evasive, conceal a deeper truth still buried in the past? Investigators revisited old sites, scoured forgotten properties, examined sealed records, chasing the faint hope that one last revelation might surface. Each search ended in silence, the earth unwilling to surrender its secrets. In the months that followed, the city grappled with the meaning of closure. Candlelight vigils transformed into memorial services. Scholarships were established in Elena's name. Her story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of vulnerability and resilience intertwined. For young medical students, she became a symbol of unrealized potential. For law enforcement, her case stood as proof that persistence could pierce even the thickest darkness. For families of other missing victims, it was a fragile beacon, suggesting that time, though cruel, was not always final. But for Keller, the case refused to settle. He replayed the interrogation in his mind, the pauses, the hesitations, the moments where Reed's narrative faltered. He studied the maps again, tracing routes along the river, marking possible detours, abandoned industrial sites, forgotten access roads. He followed instincts that had guided him for years, chasing whispers only he seemed to hear. Each lead dissolved into uncertainty, but the search continued, fueled by the stubborn belief that truth, once stirred, demanded completion. One evening, nearly a year after the verdict, Keller received a call from a construction foreman overseeing a redevelopment project along a derelict stretch of the river. Workers had uncovered something unusual while clearing debris from an old drainage culvert. Fragments of fabric, tangled in rusted wire, preserved in the damp darkness. The colors were faded, the weave familiar. Forensic teams descended on the site, their movements precise, reverent. The material matched the lining of Elena's coat. The discovery reignited hope and dread in equal measure. Excavations expanded. Soil was sifted. Concrete was chipped away. Each shovel of earth carried the weight of expectation. Days passed. Then weeks. No remains emerged. Only scattered traces, echoes of presence without form. The fragments were enough to confirm proximity, to suggest a path, but not enough to conclude a journey. The case, once again, hovered between resolution and uncertainty, suspended in the thin air of partial truth. In quiet moments, Keller wondered whether complete closure was a myth, a comforting fiction humans constructed to make sense of loss. Perhaps the truest justice lay not in final answers, but in relentless pursuit, in the refusal to forget, in the insistence that every life, no matter how long silenced, deserved to be heard. And so, even as the city moved forward, even as headlines faded and new stories claimed attention, the echo of Elena Morales' disappearance remained, woven into the fabric of Chicago, a reminder that some mysteries, once awakened, never truly returned to sleep. The sentencing hearing unfolded beneath a sky the color of ash, a dull, oppressive gray that seemed to press against the windows of the courthouse, and as Marcus Reed stood before the judge, his shoulders hunched, his eyes hollow, the weight of decades settled into a single moment of reckoning. The prosecutor spoke of stolen futures, of families condemned to endless waiting, of a city scarred by unanswered questions, while the defense clung to fragments of uncertainty, arguing for mercy in the absence of remains. But mercy, after 30 years of silence, felt like a distant abstraction. When the sentence was finally read, life without the possibility of parole, the words fell like a closing door, sealing one chapter of the story even as others remained stubbornly ajar. Reed was led away in silence, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, fading into the labyrinth of concrete and steel that would now define the remainder of his existence. Outside, the crowd exhaled, a collective release of tension that had coiled tight around the city's heart for a generation. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Cameras captured tears, embraces, trembling hands raised to cover mouths unable to contain the surge of emotion. For a brief moment, Chicago allowed itself to believe that the nightmare was over. But in the quiet that followed, unease crept back in. Because even with a verdict, even with a confession, the absence of Elena Morales remained a wound that refused to close. Her body had never been recovered. Her final resting place was unknown. And in the mind of Detective Aaron Keller, the gaps in Reed's story gnawed relentlessly, a constant, corrosive whisper that something vital was still missing. Keller returned to the case files as though drawn by gravity, spreading photographs and maps across his desk late into the night, tracing lines between locations, times, and fragments of testimony. He replayed recordings of Reed's interrogation, focusing not on what was said, but on what was avoided. Each pause, each deflection, each carefully vague description of movement. Reed had spoken of driving aimlessly, of confusion, of panic, yet the evidence suggested intention, familiarity, a route chosen with purpose. The river, the culvert, the industrial corridors along its banks, these were not random destinations. They were part of a landscape Reed knew intimately. Digging deeper, Keller uncovered Reed's employment history from the late 1980s and early 1990s. Among a scatter of short-lived delivery jobs and warehouse stints, one detail stood out: a 2-year position with a municipal waste management contractor responsible for maintenance along the Des Plaines River. Reed had worked late shifts, patrolling drainage systems, culverts, and flood control channels. He knew the hidden access points, the neglected tunnels, the forgotten service roads that threaded through the industrial underbelly of the city. He knew where shadows pooled and where noise vanished into the roar of machinery and water. He knew where secrets could be buried and forgotten. This knowledge reframed everything. Search efforts intensified, expanding beyond the immediate riverbanks into a network of derelict facilities, abandoned pumping stations, sealed storm drains, and long-neglected tunnels. Ground-penetrating radar scanned concrete floors. Cadaver dogs traced invisible paths across weed-choked lots. Drones hovered above rusted rooftops, their cameras peering into voids no human eye could reach. Each site carried the weight of expectation, the fragile hope that somewhere, hidden in the architecture of neglect, Elena's story might finally find its ending. Days blurred into weeks as teams combed through the decaying infrastructure. They unearthed relics of forgotten lives, rusted tools, discarded clothing, yellowed newspapers, bones that turned out to belong to animals. Each discovery triggered a spike of adrenaline, followed by the dull ache of disappointment. Yet Keller pressed on, driven by an instinct he could neither silence nor ignore. One evening, a call came from a maintenance supervisor overseeing the demolition of an abandoned water treatment outpost several miles downstream. Workers had uncovered a sealed access hatch beneath layers of debris and concrete. Inside, a narrow shaft descended into darkness, leading to a network of tunnels long removed from official maps. The air within was stale, tinged with the metallic scent of rust and stagnant water. Flashlights pierced the gloom, revealing walls etched with decades of mineral deposits, floors slick with algae, and scattered remnants of human presence, footprints fossilized in dried mud, cigarette butts, fragments of rope. For Keller, the space felt charged, heavy with a sense of trespass, as though they were intruding on a hidden chapter the city itself had conspired to forget. Search teams advanced carefully, documenting every inch. At the far end of one tunnel, beneath a collapsed section of piping, a cadaver dog froze, tail rigid, nostrils flaring. Handlers signaled for silence. The air seemed to thicken. Excavation began, slow and meticulous, each shovel of debris lifted as though handling something sacred. Minutes stretched into hours. And then, from beneath the rubble, emerged fragments of cloth, brittle and discolored, tangled with strands of hair. The room fell silent. Forensic specialists stepped in, their movements precise, reverent. Samples were collected, measurements taken, photographs snapped. The remains were sparse, degraded by time and moisture, but they carried the unmistakable gravity of human loss. Preliminary analysis suggested a female victim, approximate age consistent with Elena Morales. Dental records and mitochondrial DNA would later confirm what everyone already feared and hoped in equal measure. After 30 years, Elena had been found. The news reverberated through Chicago with seismic force. Vigils erupted spontaneously across the city. Churches opened their doors. Candles flickered in windows. For the Morales family, the discovery was both devastation and deliverance, a final confirmation of a truth they had long carried in their hearts. Her mother wept openly, her grief unfiltered, while her father stood in silent vigil beside the small wooden box that now held the remnants of his daughter's existence. At last, there would be a funeral. At last, a place to mourn. But the revelation reopened wounds that had only just begun to heal. Questions surged back to life. Why here? Why this tunnel, hidden beneath layers of industrial decay? What had truly transpired on that winter night? Reed, confronted with the discovery, retreated into silence, invoking his right to remain mute, his previous statements now entangled in contradiction. Prosecutors debated reopening the case to pursue additional charges, but the life sentence rendered further legal action largely symbolic. Still, the hunger for truth remained. Investigators reconstructed Reed's movements using archived traffic data, employment logs, and fragments of surveillance footage. A clearer picture began to emerge, a route tracing from Elena's apartment through a series of industrial zones, along service roads rarely used by civilians, culminating in the forgotten outpost. It was a journey of concealment, not confusion. A path chosen by someone who understood the geography of invisibility. Inside the tunnel, Forensic teams uncovered additional evidence, fibers matching the interior of Reed's car, traces of duct tape adhesive, and microscopic flecks of paint consistent with the chipped door of the dark sedan. Each discovery tightened the narrative, transforming ambiguity into intention. The night of February 12, 1992, crystallized into a sequence of calculated decisions, each one narrowing Elena's chances of survival. As the details surfaced, public reaction oscillated between horror and grim fascination. The story of the tunnel, the hidden networks beneath the city, the idea that such spaces could harbor unimaginable acts, ignited a fresh wave of fear. Urban explorers came forward with their own tales of shadowed corridors and sealed chambers, of whispers echoing through concrete arteries. The underworld of Chicago, long ignored, suddenly loomed large in the collective imagination. Yet for Keller, the discovery brought a quieter, more complicated sense of closure. He visited the site alone one evening, long after the media frenzy had subsided. The tunnel lay empty now, its secrets extracted, its silence restored. Standing there, he felt the weight of years lift slightly from his chest, replaced by a solemn resolve. The truth, once buried, had been unearthed. Elena's story, once fragmented, had found its shape, but the cost, measured in decades of grief, could never be repaid. In the weeks that followed, preparations began for Elena's memorial. Friends she had once studied alongside, now doctors, nurses, and surgeons, returned to honor the life interrupted. They spoke of her laughter, her ambition, her stubborn optimism. They shared memories that painted her not as a victim, but as a vibrant presence, a young woman poised on the edge of a meaningful future. As her ashes were laid to rest, the city bowed its head, acknowledging both the resolution of a long nightmare and the permanence of loss. And yet, even as the case reached its long-delayed conclusion, its echoes lingered. Cold cases across the city were reopened. DNA samples re-examined. Forgotten files dusted off and scrutinized anew. Elena's story became a catalyst, a reminder that time, though relentless, was not insurmountable. That truth, though patient, could still be coaxed into the light. That even in the deepest shadows, the possibility of revelation endured. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city slept and the river slid past its banks in near silence, the memory of that winter night persisted, a cautionary whisper threading through the darkness, urging vigilance, remembrance, and the unyielding pursuit of justice, no matter how long the road. In the months after Elena Morales was finally laid to rest, Chicago tried to move forward, but the city did so unevenly, as though one foot remained trapped in the shadow of 1992. The headlines faded, the cameras withdrew, and the courthouse steps returned to their usual quiet, yet beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. The discovery of Elena's remains, hidden for 3 decades in a forgotten tunnel, had torn open a deeper unease, exposing how easily entire lives could disappear into the blind spots of a sprawling metropolis. Every flickering streetlight, every deserted underpass, every sealed door in an abandoned building now seemed charged with new meaning. For Detective Aaron Keller, the case refused to release its grip. The verdict and sentencing had delivered justice in a legal sense, but psychologically, the investigation felt unfinished, like a book missing its final pages. He returned to Reed's confession transcripts repeatedly, studying the cadence of his words, the pattern of his evasions, the moments where his voice faltered. Reed had admitted to abduction. He had admitted to coercion. But he had never explicitly described the final act, the precise instant when Elena's life ended. That silence, heavy and deliberate, gnawed at Keller's mind. In interviews after the sentencing, Keller was asked whether he believed Reed would ever reveal the full truth. He answered carefully, choosing restraint over speculation, yet privately he suspected that some secrets were locked too deep, sealed by fear, shame, or a twisted sense of control. For men like Reed, withholding the final detail was often the last remaining source of power. It was a way to dominate the narrative even after everything else had been stripped away. Yet the investigation's ripple effects were only beginning. Within weeks of the tunnel discovery, Chicago's cold case unit experienced a surge of renewed activity. Tip lines flooded with calls. Retired officers came forward with forgotten notes. Families of missing persons pleaded for their loved ones' files to be reopened. The story of Elena Morales had cracked something open in the public psyche, igniting a fragile hope that time might not be the enemy it seemed. That even the oldest wounds could still bleed truth. Among the calls that reached Keller's desk was one that arrived late on a rain-soaked evening, its urgency cutting through the static of routine procedure. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman in her early 40s, trembling, uncertain, yet resolute. She introduced herself as Marisol Vega and said she had survived an encounter with Marcus Reed in the summer of 1991, an encounter she had never reported. Her story unfolded in broken fragments. She had been 19, newly arrived in Chicago, working nights at a diner near the river. Reed had approached her as she closed up, offering a ride home, claiming to recognize her from the neighborhood. She hesitated. He insisted. When she declined, he followed her, grabbed her arm, forced her into his car. She described the smell of gasoline, the sting of duct tape on her wrists, the suffocating darkness as the city lights dissolved into industrial wasteland. He drove for hours, threatening, cajoling, oscillating between charm and menace. She believed she was going to die. Then, without warning, he released her near a warehouse district, shoving her out of the car and speeding away. She staggered into the night, terrified, ashamed, convinced that no one would believe her. She never reported the attack. Instead, she fled the city, burying the memory beneath years of silence. When Elena's case resurfaced, Marisol felt the past claw its way back into the present. The details matched too closely. The sedan, the route, the river, the terror. For decades, she had told herself she was alone. Now she realized she had been one of many. Her testimony sent shockwaves through the investigation. Keller reopened the files of unsolved assaults and disappearances from the late 1980s and early 1990s, overlaying them with Reed's employment records, known addresses, and traffic citations. Patterns crystallized with chilling clarity. At least 6 women had reported near-identical experiences: abduction attempts, forced drives through industrial corridors, threats, and eventual release. Some cases had been dismissed for lack of evidence. Others had never been officially recorded. Each now formed part of a disturbing mosaic that reframed Reed not as an isolated predator, but as a serial offender whose crimes had been obscured by fear, stigma, and institutional limitations. The realization unsettled the city. If Reed had operated undetected for so long, how many others like him existed, hidden in plain sight? How many victims had vanished without ever being counted? The narrative shifted from a singular tragedy to a broader indictment of silence and systemic failure. Editorials demanded reform. Community groups organized forums. Survivors shared their stories, their voices rising in a fragile chorus of defiance. For the Morales family, this expansion of the case brought mixed emotions. On one hand, it confirmed that Elena's disappearance had not been random, that her suffering was part of a larger pattern, a truth that offered grim clarity. On the other, it deepened their grief, forcing them to confront the magnitude of harm inflicted by a single individual over years of unchecked predation. Elena had not simply been lost. She had been caught in the machinery of a nightmare far larger than anyone had imagined. Meanwhile, Reed remained silent. Transferred to a maximum security facility, he retreated into isolation, refusing interviews, declining counseling, ignoring correspondence. Letters from journalists went unanswered. Requests from investigators were met with cold indifference. Even his own legal team struggled to elicit cooperation. In rare moments of conversation, he spoke only in vague generalities, hinting at remorse without ever articulating it, acknowledging wrongdoing without ever detailing it. His refusal to fully confess became a second crime, a denial of the final piece of truth his victims so desperately sought. Keller visited him once more, standing across the reinforced glass of the prison visitation room, their reflections overlapping faintly in the sterile glare of fluorescent lights. He spoke not of evidence, not of charges, but of closure, of families waiting, of nights haunted by uncertainty. He described Elena's funeral, the trembling hands of her parents, the small wooden box lowered into the earth. Reed listened, his face impassive, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the room. When Keller asked directly where Elena had died, Reed's lips twitched, as if caught between confession and concealment. He leaned forward, lowered his voice, and said only that some truths, once spoken, could never be taken back. Then he stood, signaling the end of the visit, and was led away without another word. That silence became its own kind of verdict. Across Chicago, the ripple effects continued to unfold. Law enforcement agencies implemented new protocols for handling missing persons cases, emphasizing early action, cross-jurisdictional cooperation, and the preservation of forensic evidence. Cold case units received increased funding. DNA databases expanded. Training programs focused on recognizing behavioral patterns that might otherwise remain hidden. Elena's story became part of the curriculum, a case study in both failure and redemption. Yet for many, the emotional residue of the case lingered long after institutional reforms took shape. In the neighborhoods along the river, residents spoke in hushed tones about the tunnels, about the unseen world beneath their feet. Urban legends flourished, blending fact and fiction into a tapestry of fear and fascination. Parents warned their children to stay in well-lit areas. Commuters quickened their pace after dark. The river itself, once a symbol of endurance and continuity, now carried an undercurrent of dread. And still, unanswered questions persisted. Had Reed truly acted alone? The scale and duration of his crimes suggested meticulous planning, an understanding of surveillance gaps, a familiarity with logistical evasion that seemed difficult to reconcile with solitary action. Investigators scrutinized his associations, probing old friendships, employment networks, and transient connections. No concrete accomplices emerged, but the absence of proof did little to quell suspicion. In the shadows of every unsolved detail lurked the possibility of complicity, of unseen hands that had helped shape the darkness. As the seasons turned, Keller found himself drawn back to the river, walking its banks in the early morning, when the city still slept and the water mirrored the pale light of dawn. He listened to its slow, relentless movement, imagining the countless secrets it had carried away. Each ripple seemed to whisper of moments lost, of lives diverted from their intended paths. In those quiet hours, the boundary between past and present blurred, and the cold case felt less like history than a living presence, breathing softly in the spaces between heartbeats. For all the progress made, for all the truths uncovered, the story of Elena Morales remained unfinished in subtle, insidious ways. Her life had been reclaimed from oblivion, her name restored to the living memory of the city, yet the precise contours of her final moments remained veiled. The unanswered lingered, refusing to be neatly packaged into resolution. And perhaps that, more than anything, was the enduring lesson of the case, that even when justice speaks, even when verdicts are rendered and sentences imposed, the echoes of violence persist, threading through time, shaping the fears and hopes of those left behind. That closure, so often promised, is rarely complete. That the past, once awakened, never fully releases its hold. As Chicago moved forward, rebuilding, redefining, and reimagining itself, the memory of a young woman who vanished into the night in 1992 continued to cast a long, indelible shadow, a reminder that beneath the rhythms of everyday life, unseen histories pulse, waiting, always waiting, to be heard. The years that followed unfolded with a deceptive calm, as if the city, exhausted by decades of unresolved fear, had collectively exhaled and decided to believe that the worst was finally behind it. The river continued its slow, indifferent passage through Chicago. The tunnels were sealed, their entrances welded shut, their darkness entombed beneath concrete and steel. Elena Morales's name slipped gradually from headlines into footnotes, into archived files, into the quiet corners of memory. Yet beneath this fragile surface of peace, a deeper reckoning was underway, one that would ripple far beyond a single case, reshaping how the city understood its own shadows. Cold case units across Illinois began reopening dormant investigations, driven by a surge of public pressure and the unsettling realization that entire eras of crime had slipped through the cracks of outdated technology and overwhelmed systems. Evidence lockers were unsealed. Yellowed reports were digitized. Audio tapes were restored, their hiss and crackle resurrecting voices long stilled. Each reopened file carried the same fragile promise that somewhere, buried in the residue of forgotten details, truth still waited. Keller became a central figure in this revival, his work on the Morales case cited in training seminars and law enforcement conferences as proof that persistence could breach even the thickest darkness. But with recognition came a burden. Families of the missing flooded his office with letters, photographs, and desperate pleas. Mothers clutched fading portraits of daughters lost decades earlier. Brothers recounted last phone calls. Fathers traced routes that had once seemed insignificant, now scrutinized for hidden meaning. Each story was a mirror of the last, a chorus of unfinished grief demanding attention. One such plea arrived in a thin, creased envelope, postmarked from a small town on the outskirts of Joliet. Inside lay a photograph of a teenage girl, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, her smile tentative yet hopeful. On the back, a single line: Lena Park, missing since 1994. The accompanying letter was brief, written in careful, halting English by her mother, who begged for any help, any insight, any chance of resolution. Keller set the file aside at first, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of similar requests. But something about the date caught his attention. 1994, just 2 years after Elena Morales vanished. Just 2 years after Reed's last known assault. The patterns once again stirred. As Keller delved into Lena Park's case, eerie similarities emerged. She had been last seen walking home from a late shift at a bakery. Witnesses reported a dark sedan idling nearby. A neighbor recalled the faint echo of raised voices. Her purse was found discarded near a drainage canal. No body was ever recovered. At the time, the disappearance had been attributed to runaway speculation, a conclusion driven more by convenience than evidence. Now, under renewed scrutiny, the narrative began to fracture. Keller cross-referenced Reed's movements, employment records, and known addresses from that period. The trail led uncomfortably close to Lena's neighborhood. Traffic citations placed Reed within blocks of her last known location days before she vanished. A former coworker remembered him boasting cryptically about a close call in early 1994. None of it constituted proof. All of it suggested possibility. The revelation reignited old fears. Had Reed's reach extended further than anyone realized? Had the tunnel beneath the river concealed not one secret, but many? Forensic teams revisited the site, expanding their search into adjacent networks previously deemed irrelevant. Ground-penetrating radar swept across sealed corridors. Excavations resumed in derelict zones once considered exhausted. Each probe felt like a descent into buried history, a confrontation with the unknown. Fragments surfaced.
Bones. Fabric.
Personal items. Some were animal, others human. DNA analysis began a slow, painstaking process of identification, each sample compared against missing persons databases that span generations. Matches trickled in, each one a small detonation of grief and relief. A woman missing since 1987. A man last seen in 1990. Strangers bound by geography and circumstance, united in death beneath layers of neglect. The scope of the discovery transformed the tunnel from a singular crime scene into a mass grave of forgotten victims, its darkness absorbing stories that might otherwise have been remembered. Public reaction was immediate and visceral. Headlines blared of hidden cemeteries beneath the city. Talk shows debated institutional culpability. Community forums erupted with anger and fear. How could such horrors have remained concealed for so long? How many cries for help had gone unheard? How many families had been told to move on, to accept ambiguity, to let go? Municipal leaders promised transparency. Independent commissions were formed. Audits scrutinized decades of investigative practices. Funding surged toward forensic infrastructure and missing persons advocacy. Yet for those directly affected, institutional reform offered little comfort. The dead were still dead. The years still lost. In prison, Reed remained unmoved. When confronted with evidence suggesting additional victims, he denied knowledge, retreating deeper into silence. Psychologists speculated that his refusal stemmed from a pathological need for control, a desire to retain ownership of secrets even as his world collapsed. Others argued that his memory, eroded by time and guilt, might genuinely fail him. Whatever the cause, the result was the same: a widening chasm between what was known and what could be proven. Keller grappled with the implications. If Reed had not been responsible for all the remains discovered, then someone else had been. Another predator. Another shadow moving undetected through the city's veins. The possibility chilled him. The tunnel, once thought to be a singular anomaly, now suggested a convergence point, a dark crossroads where multiple narratives of violence intersected. The city's underworld, long ignored, revealed itself as a palimpsest of suffering, each layer obscuring the last. As investigations expanded, so too did the emotional toll. Detectives burned out. Forensic analysts worked double shifts, their eyes strained by endless hours under fluorescent lights. Families oscillated between hope and despair, their lives suspended in the limbo of waiting. Each new discovery reopened old wounds, forcing them to relive the moment of disappearance with renewed intensity. Yet amid the exhaustion, small victories emerged. A necklace found beneath a collapsed tunnel wall was identified as belonging to a woman missing since 1989. Her daughter, now a middle-aged mother herself, wept as she finally learned where her own life had fractured. A set of keys led investigators to a storage unit containing personal effects of a man who vanished during a labor strike, his story lost amid political turmoil. Each resolution, however partial, stitched a fragile thread of meaning into the vast tapestry of loss. Through it all, Elena Morales' name remained central, a catalyst and a compass. Her case had cracked the silence. Her memory propelled the search. In classrooms and police academies, her story became emblematic of perseverance, a testament to the necessity of relentless inquiry. Scholarships in her name funded forensic science students, young minds eager to unravel the mysteries left behind by previous generations. Her life, though stolen, continued to shape futures in ways she could never have imagined. But the question lingered, unresolved and unyielding: how many stories still lay buried? One autumn evening, as Keller prepared to leave the precinct, he found a new file waiting on his desk, its cover stamped with a familiar designation: Cold Case. Inside were reports from 1978, detailing the disappearance of a college student last seen near the river. The similarities were unsettling, the patterns hauntingly familiar. The shadows, once again, stirred. He closed the folder slowly, aware that the path he walked had no clear end, only an endless procession of unanswered questions stretching into the past. Each solved case seemed to illuminate another, each revelation opening doors to deeper uncertainty. The city, for all its light and motion, harbored a vast subterranean memory, and somewhere within it, truths waited, patient and unrelenting. As night settled over Chicago, the river glinted beneath the streetlights, its surface betraying nothing of the histories flowing beneath. In its quiet persistence lay both a promise and a warning, that time could carry secrets away, but it could also return them, piece by fragile piece, to those willing to look into the darkness and listen. And in that darkness, the echo of a young woman's footsteps still lingered, guiding the search, urging it forward, reminding all who followed that no disappearance, no matter how old, was ever truly beyond the reach of memory. Winter returned to Chicago with an unforgiving chill, frosting the riverbanks and sealing the city in a shell of brittle silence, and in that stillness, The reopened investigations began to converge, their scattered threads twisting together into a shape no one had anticipated. What started as a single cold case, a solitary tragedy anchored in 1992, had evolved into something far more unsettling, a constellation of disappearances, assaults, and deaths spanning decades, linked not by a single perpetrator, but by geography, opportunity, and the vast, unexamined spaces beneath the city. The tunnels had become the epicenter of that revelation. Engineers, historians, and forensic specialists were brought in to map the subterranean network in its entirety. Old municipal blueprints were unearthed, some dating back to the late 19th century, others sketched hastily during wartime infrastructure expansions. Layer upon layer of forgotten construction revealed a labyrinthine underworld, storm drains feeding into flood channels, maintenance corridors intersecting abandoned rail spurs, sealed shafts plunging deep beneath industrial districts. Entire neighborhoods were laced with hidden passageways, unseen arteries pulsing beneath the concrete skin of modern life. As the map expanded, so did the implications. Keller stood before the illuminated schematic one night, tracing the branching lines with his finger, feeling the weight of invisible history pressing against his chest.
This was not a single dumping ground. It was a system, a network of concealment, a geography of disappearance. The tunnels did not merely hide the dead, they absorbed them, dissolving identities into damp darkness, scattering memory until only faint echoes remained. Teams fanned out across the city, guided by the growing map, descending into newly identified access points. Each descent felt like crossing a threshold between worlds. Above ground, traffic roared and neon lights flickered. Below, the air hung stale and metallic, footsteps echoed endlessly, and time itself seemed suspended. In these spaces, past and present merged, and every shadow carried the possibility of revelation. The discoveries continued. In a sealed chamber beneath an abandoned factory, they uncovered a cluster of skeletal remains wrapped in rotted fabric. Dental records identified two as teenage runaways reported missing in 1984. A third belonged to a man who vanished after leaving a union meeting in 1979. None of their cases had ever been connected. None had even been suspected of intersecting. Now, in death, their stories converged, bound by proximity and silence. Public reaction swelled into a volatile mixture of grief, rage, and disbelief. The notion that the city's foundations concealed such horrors shattered long-held assumptions about safety and oversight. Calls for accountability intensified. How could this vast underworld have remained so poorly monitored? How many warnings had been ignored? How many opportunities to intervene had slipped past unnoticed? City officials faced mounting pressure. Emergency funding was allocated to survey and secure subterranean infrastructure. Inspection teams sealed unauthorized access points. Lighting and surveillance systems were installed in critical areas. Yet these measures, though necessary, felt reactive, arriving decades too late for those already lost. For families, the renewed investigations were both a blessing and a torment. Each new discovery carried the promise of resolution, but also the risk of renewed devastation. Waiting became a ritual, a daily oscillation between hope and dread. Phone calls from the medical examiner's office were both anticipated and feared. The past refused to remain buried, demanding recognition with relentless persistence. Keller found himself immersed in a world where closure was provisional, where every answer generated new questions. He began to suspect that the tunnels had served not merely as dumping grounds, but as conduits for illicit activity, smuggling, unregistered labor, clandestine gatherings, a shadow economy thriving beneath the visible city. In such an environment, violence could occur unseen, and bodies could vanish without immediate consequence. This suspicion drew the attention of federal agencies, whose own archives hinted at unresolved investigations into organized crime operations along the river during the 1970s and 1980s. Task forces were assembled. Records cross-referenced. Old informants were tracked down, their memories coaxed from reluctant minds. Slowly, a parallel narrative surfaced,
one of corruption, intimidation, and complicity that had allowed entire networks of exploitation to flourish. In that context, Marcus Reed's crimes, though monstrous, appeared as part of a broader ecosystem of neglect and opportunity. He was not the architect of the darkness, but one of its beneficiaries, a predator exploiting gaps carved by decades of oversight failure. This realization reframed the case yet again, shifting focus from individual guilt to systemic vulnerability. Keller struggled with this perspective. For him, justice had always been personal, rooted in the belief that every victim deserved individual recognition, every perpetrator individual accountability. Yet the scale of what they were uncovering threatened to reduce lives to data points, tragedies to patterns. He resisted that abstraction, insisting on names, faces, stories. Each file he opened became a vow, a promise to honor the specificity of loss. One such file belonged to Daniel Ortiz, a 22-year-old mechanic who disappeared in 1981 after finishing a late shift near the river. His case had languished for decades, dismissed as voluntary absence. But a fragment of bone recovered from a tunnel branch matched his DNA, finally anchoring his story to a physical place. When Keller visited Daniel's elderly mother to deliver the news, she wept with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude, clutching his childhood photograph as though it were a lifeline. For her, certainty, however devastating, was preferable to endless doubt. Moments like these sustained Keller, even as the emotional toll mounted. He slept little, haunted by dreams of endless corridors and nameless faces. The boundaries between cases blurred, each disappearance echoing the last. His colleagues worried about burnout, urging him to step back, to delegate, to rest. But rest felt like betrayal. How could he pause when so many stories remained unresolved? In prison, Reed's silence took on a new dimension. As revelations mounted, speculation swirled about his possible connections to broader criminal networks. Investigators attempted to probe these links, offering reduced isolation, improved conditions, even the promise of contact with distant relatives. Reed refused all incentives. He remained an island of opacity, a man sealed within his own unspoken narrative. Psychiatric evaluations suggested a personality shaped by control and secrecy, a psyche that derived power from withholding truth. In this light, his refusal to elaborate was not apathy, but assertion, a final, perverse exercise of agency. By guarding his secrets, he denied victims and families the solace of full understanding, perpetuating his dominance even from behind bars. The implications were chilling. If Reed had acted within a larger web of illicit activity, his silence protected not only himself, but others. The tunnels, once thought to be mere infrastructure, now loomed as potential conduits of organized exploitation, their secrecy shielding crimes that extended beyond any single case. As winter deepened, federal investigators uncovered evidence of clandestine transport routes running through the subterranean network, used to move contraband and undocumented laborers during the late 20th century. Financial records hinted at payoffs to municipal employees tasked with infrastructure oversight. The narrative expanded into a complex web of corruption and complicity, suggesting that the darkness beneath Chicago was not accidental, but cultivated. Public trust wavered. Town halls overflowed with angry citizens demanding transparency. Lawsuits mounted. Editorials condemned decades of negligence. The city's image, once anchored in resilience and innovation, now bore the stain of hidden atrocity. Yet even amid outrage, a paradoxical pride emerged, pride in the tenacity of those who refused to let the past remain silent, who dug into forgotten spaces and unearthed uncomfortable truths. In the midst of this upheaval, Elena Morales' story remained a focal point, a moral compass guiding the investigation. Her life, brief yet luminous, anchored the sprawling narrative in human specificity. She was not a statistic. She was a daughter, a student, a dreamer. Her disappearance had cracked the facade of normalcy, revealing the abyss beneath. Keller often returned to her photograph, the one taken just months before she vanished, her eyes bright, her smile unguarded. In that image, he found both motivation and restraint, a reminder that the pursuit of truth, however relentless, must remain tethered to empathy. As the thaw of early spring loosened winter's grip, new discoveries awaited, each promising to further unravel the tangled history buried beneath the city. The path ahead was uncertain, the destination obscured by layers of secrecy and time. Yet one thing was clear. The cold case that began in 1992 had evolved into a reckoning far larger than anyone had imagined, a confrontation not merely with a single crime, but with the hidden architecture of silence itself. And in that confrontation, the city of Chicago stood at a crossroads, poised between the comfort of forgetting and the courage of remembrance, aware that only by facing the depths could it hope to reclaim the light. Spring arrived hesitantly, as if uncertain whether the city deserved renewal, and with it came a surge of revelations that pushed the investigation into territory no one had dared to imagine. The thaw exposed more than thawed ground. It uncovered stories frozen in fear, sealed beneath decades of neglect, now bleeding back into the present with relentless force. Each new discovery tightened the narrative, transforming isolated tragedies into a single, sprawling chronicle of hidden violence, one that reached far beyond a lone perpetrator and into the deep architecture of systemic failure. The tunnels, once considered mere conduits of water and waste, had become a shadow archive of the city's forgotten dead. As excavations expanded, forensic teams encountered deeper layers of burial, older remains compressed into narrow cavities carved by erosion and human design. Radiocarbon dating placed some fragments as far back as the early 1960s. These were not modern crimes. They were echoes of a pattern stretching across generations, woven into the fabric of Chicago's subterranean world. The realization unsettled even the most seasoned investigators. What they were facing was not a cluster of unrelated acts, but a continuum of opportunity exploited again and again by those who understood how easily darkness could swallow consequence. In this environment, predators did not need to innovate. They only needed to observe, to learn, to inherit the geography of disappearance. The tunnels taught their own lessons: where to hide, how to evade, how to erase. Keller felt the weight of that history pressing against him as he walked through the newly charted corridors, the beam of his flashlight gliding across damp concrete etched with time. Every footprint, every rusted hook embedded in the walls, every discarded tool hinted at lives intersecting in secrecy. The air itself seemed saturated with memory, heavy with the residue of fear and finality. He wondered how many crimes had occurred in these spaces without ever registering on the surface world, how many screams had been absorbed by the labyrinth, how many bodies had dissolved into anonymity. As the scope widened, federal authorities took control of key segments of the investigation, bringing in specialists in organized crime, infrastructure security, and historical forensic analysis. Their mandate extended beyond individual cases, aiming to reconstruct the operational dynamics of the underground network itself. Who built it? Who maintained it? Who benefited from its concealment? And most chillingly, who had known? Financial audits began tracing public works contracts dating back half a century. Patterns emerged: inflated budgets, unaccounted expenditures, shell companies with ties to known criminal syndicates. The city's subterranean maintenance system, once a mundane bureaucratic concern, now appeared riddled with corruption, its blind spots deliberately cultivated. Investigators uncovered evidence of bribes paid to inspectors, falsified safety reports, and deliberate omissions in mapping records, all contributing to an infrastructure of invisibility. This web of deceit suggested that the tunnels were not merely forgotten, but intentionally ignored, preserved as unregulated spaces where accountability dissolved. The public response shifted from shock to fury. Protests erupted outside City Hall. Survivors and families of the missing demanded resignations, indictments, systemic reform. Murals sprang up along riverfront walls, bearing the faces of victims whose names had never appeared in headlines. Candlelight vigils transformed into marches, their quiet sorrow hardening into collective resolve. The city was no longer content with answers about the past. It wanted assurances for the future. Amid the chaos, Keller remained focused on the human core of the investigation. For him, every bone fragment, every scrap of fabric, represented a life abruptly severed. He spent long nights contacting families, delivering news that oscillated between devastating and redemptive. Some wept in gratitude, relieved to finally know. Others collapsed under the weight of confirmation, their decades of hope extinguished in a single breath. Each conversation left him emotionally raw, yet resolute. The stories deserved to be heard, no matter how painful. One such call led him to a small apartment on the city's west side, where an elderly man lived alone among stacks of yellowed newspapers and fading photographs. His sister, Rosa Delgado, had vanished in 1972 after leaving her job at a garment factory near the river. The case had gone cold within weeks. When Keller presented the forensic match linking her remains to the tunnel network, the man sat in stunned silence, his fingers tracing the edges of a photograph taken on Rosa's 17th birthday. After a long moment, he whispered that he had always known she was gone, but that knowing where she ended changed everything. Now, he said, she could come home. Such moments anchored Keller, reminding him that the investigation, however vast, remained fundamentally about restoring dignity to the lost. Yet, even as answers surfaced, new mysteries emerged. Among the recovered items was a set of coded ledgers, preserved in a watertight container lodged within a collapsed shaft. The pages, brittle yet legible, contained sequences of numbers and initials, cross-referenced with dates spanning nearly 40 years. Analysts suspected they were records of illicit transactions, payments, deliveries, movements, their cryptic shorthand concealing a ledger of hidden commerce. Decryption efforts revealed recurring initials, some belonging to known crime figures, others to municipal employees long retired or deceased. The implications were staggering. A clandestine economy operating beneath the city, its transactions masked by bureaucratic complexity and infrastructural neglect. The ledgers reframed the tunnels not merely as crime scenes, but as arteries of an underground system that thrived on invisibility. This revelation ignited a parallel investigation, one that stretched into federal courtrooms and congressional hearings. Subpoenas flew. Archives were seized. Whistleblowers emerged, their testimonies exposing decades of collusion between criminal enterprises and corrupt officials. Careers collapsed. Reputations shattered. The narrative expanded beyond Chicago, revealing similar patterns in other major cities, suggesting a nationwide architecture of subterranean exploitation. The cold case that began with Elena Morales had become a catalyst for systemic reckoning. Yet for all the institutional upheaval, the emotional gravity of individual loss remained paramount. Memorials multiplied across the city, plaques along the river, installations in public squares, quiet gardens dedicated to the unnamed. Schools incorporated lessons on civic responsibility and vigilance. Community patrols formed, reclaiming neglected spaces and transforming them into sites of collective care. Elena's scholarship program expanded, funding research into forensic archaeology and infrastructure mapping, ensuring that future investigators would be equipped to probe even the most concealed environments. Her legacy, once defined by absence, now manifested as action, as transformation, as an insistence that no life vanish without consequence. Keller watched these changes unfold with a mixture of pride and melancholy. He had devoted his career to chasing shadows, yet the shadows seemed endless, retreating even as he advanced. The deeper he dug, the more expansive the darkness revealed itself to be. It was a paradox he had come to accept, that the pursuit of truth was not a journey toward finality, but an ongoing negotiation with uncertainty. Late one night, as rain streaked down the precinct windows, Keller sat alone, poring over the tunnel maps, tracing the interwoven routes that crisscrossed beneath the city. He imagined the countless footsteps that had echoed through those corridors, the whispered conversations, the hurried movements, the final moments of those who never emerged. In that labyrinth, time collapsed, past and present entwined, each layer of concrete a sediment of human experience. His phone vibrated, shattering the silence.
The call came from a rural sheriff's office nearly 200 miles south, reporting the discovery of human remains near an abandoned railway spur. Preliminary evidence suggested a connection to the Chicago tunnel network. Identical fiber traces, similar binding materials, a familiar pattern of concealment. The geography of disappearance, it seemed, extended beyond the city limits, following the veins of forgotten infrastructure across the state. The investigation, once thought vast, had just grown larger. Keller closed his eyes briefly, feeling the familiar weight settle upon him. The cold case was no longer a case. It was a phenomenon, a mirror held up to society's blind spots, reflecting uncomfortable truths about neglect, vulnerability, and the cost of silence. Each answer carried the seed of another question, each resolution unveiling deeper complexity. As dawn crept across the skyline, painting the river in muted gold, Keller rose from his chair, gathering the files that would accompany him into the next chapter of pursuit. Somewhere, beyond the city's glow, more stories waited to be uncovered, more lives to be reclaimed from oblivion. The darkness had not yet yielded all its secrets. And until it did, the echo of 1992 would continue to guide his steps, a distant heartbeat pulsing beneath the streets, urging him onward into the unknown. The city had changed its face, but the shadow of 1992 never left it. Not for a single night, not for a single sleepless hour, not for a single family that had once waited behind darkened windows, hoping for footsteps that never came, and now, after decades of silence, that shadow stirred again, crawling out of forgotten files, flickering surveillance tapes, and the trembling voices of witnesses who had grown old with their secrets, as a new generation of detectives reopened the cold case, dragging the past into a present that no longer recognized it, yet could not escape it, because every street, every brick, every rusted fire escape still remembered what happened, still whispered the name of the girl who vanished into Chicago's unforgiving night, still echoed the unanswered question that had haunted the city for 30 long years. Who took her, and why? The case file was thick, swollen with decades of dead ends, false confessions, anonymous tips, and half-formed theories, a paper monument to failure, and when Detective Marcus Hale first lifted it from the evidence archive, dust clouded the air like a warning, as though the past itself resisted being disturbed, as though the truth had learned how to hide in the dark. But Hale did not flinch, because he had grown up hearing the story, had grown up seeing the faded missing posters tacked to abandoned storefronts, had grown up with the fear that if something so terrible could happen to her, it could happen to anyone, and now, standing alone under flickering fluorescent lights, he felt the weight of those years settle onto his shoulders, a burden he did not ask for, but one he could no longer ignore. The first breakthrough did not come from a dramatic confession or a miraculous DNA hit, but from a brittle cassette tape, buried inside a mislabeled box in a forgotten evidence locker, a recording of an anonymous 911 call placed just minutes after the last confirmed sighting of the victim, a call that had been dismissed in 1992 as a prank, static-heavy, distorted, chaotic, but now, when digital forensic analysts cleaned the audio, stripping away the noise layer by layer, a voice emerged, shaky and urgent, whispering directions, street names, a description of a struggle, and then a single phrase that froze everyone who heard it. He's forcing her into the car. Hurry. And suddenly the case was no longer frozen in time, no longer a relic, but a living, breathing threat that had simply learned how to wait. The coordinates embedded in that whisper pointed to a narrow alley just 3 blocks from the victim's apartment, an alley that had been paved over, its cracked concrete replaced, its dumpsters relocated, its graffiti erased, but beneath the modern surface, the past still lingered, and when ground-penetrating radar was brought in, investigators detected anomalies, subtle disturbances in the soil that suggested something heavy had once been dragged across it, something that resisted, something that left a silent trail, and although no remains were found, the discovery shattered the long-held belief that she had vanished without a trace, proving instead that she had fought, that she had been close, painfully close, to safety, and that someone had been watching her long before she ever realized she was in danger. That realization reframed everything.
transforming the investigation from a mystery into a manhunt delayed by 3 decades. And as detectives revisited old witness statements, patterns began to emerge, fragile at first, then impossible to ignore. A cluster of sightings near that alley, reports of a dark sedan idling late at night, a man seen smoking beneath a flickering street lamp, always in the same spot, always at the same hour. A ghost presence so consistent it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. And when those fragments were layered over traffic records, parking violations, and outdated city surveillance footage, a single vehicle began to surface, its license plate blurred, its registration long expired, but its silhouette unmistakable, captured again and again in the background of unrelated crime scenes, like a predator passing unnoticed through a herd. The car led them to a name, buried beneath layers of outdated paperwork, a man who had once lived only 2 blocks from the victim, a man with a minor criminal history, a man who had been questioned briefly in 1992 and dismissed for lack of evidence, a man who had since disappeared from Chicago's public records, as though swallowed by the decades. And when detectives tracked him down, they found not a hardened criminal mastermind, but a frail, aging figure in a suburban nursing home. His once sharp eyes dulled, his hands trembling, his voice thin, yet beneath the surface, something else stirred, something cold and alert, something that recognized danger even now, even after all these years. At first, he denied everything, repeating rehearsed lines, claiming fading memory, confusion, a life too long and too ordinary to conceal something so monstrous. But investigators had learned patience from the case itself, and they did not rush, did not threaten, did not accuse. They simply spoke, calmly, methodically, recounting details no one else could know, describing the alley, the car, the cigarette burns on the pavement, the whispers captured on that lost tape, and with each word, the man's composure cracked, his breathing quickened, his gaze shifted toward invisible exits, until finally, his silence became louder than any confession. What followed was not the dramatic breakdown scene in courtroom dramas, but something far more unsettling, a slow unraveling, a gradual erosion of denial, as fragments of memory surfaced against his will, flashes of headlights cutting through rain, the weight of a struggling body, the metallic taste of fear, and although he never uttered the words, his body language told a story his mouth refused to speak. And for the first time in 3 decades, investigators felt they were standing on the edge of the truth, staring into a darkness that no longer seemed endless. Yet the deeper they dug, the more disturbing the picture became, because this man was not an isolated predator, not a lone shadow slipping through the cracks of the city, but part of a loose, informal network, a group of men connected by shared habits, shared secrets, shared hunting grounds, men who gathered in dive bars, who exchanged information in coded glances, who exploited the anonymity of a city that never stopped moving, and suddenly the victim's disappearance looked less like a random act of violence and more like a calculated operation, planned, rehearsed, perfected over time, hidden behind ordinary routines and familiar faces. Files from other unsolved disappearances began to align, their timelines overlapping, their locations intersecting, their details echoing one another in chilling harmony, and a horrifying possibility emerged that the girl from 1992 had not been the first, and she had not been the last, that the city's cold cases were not isolated tragedies, but chapters of a single, sprawling nightmare, stitched together by silence, neglect, and the slow erosion of memory. And as that realization settled in, it cast a new light on every unsolved file, every faded photograph, every unanswered call, turning the investigation into something far larger than anyone had anticipated. Families who had long abandoned hope were contacted, their grief reopened, their scars torn wide, as detectives asked them to revisit the worst days of their lives, to remember details they had buried for survival, and although many could barely speak, their testimonies filled gaps, connecteds, created a map of sorrow stretching across decades, and with each new statement, the scope of the horror expanded, revealing a city that had been hunted from within,
a predator that had blended seamlessly into everyday life, leaving devastation in its wake. Public attention exploded as news outlets resurrected the case, splashing headlines across screens and front pages, turning the once-forgotten story into a national obsession. And with that spotlight came pressure, relentless, unforgiving, pushing investigators to move faster, to dig deeper, to find proof that could stand in court, not just suspicion, not just patterns, but undeniable evidence. And so they returned to the physical world, to the places where it had all begun, searching for traces that time had failed to erase. In a long-abandoned warehouse slated for demolition, forensic teams uncovered fibers embedded in the floorboards, fragments of clothing that matched the victim's last known outfit, microscopic residues that spoke of restraint, of struggle, of captivity. And although the building had changed hands multiple times, its walls still held the echo of what had happened inside. And when those fragments were analyzed, they confirmed what investigators had begun to fear. She had been held, imprisoned, tortured by uncertainty, by fear, by the knowledge that no one could hear her. And then, at some point, she had vanished again, leaving behind only silence and dust. The discovery did not bring closure, but it shifted the narrative, transforming the story from disappearance to captivity, from mystery to prolonged horror, and in doing so, it reignited a collective rage, a demand for justice that transcended generations, as those who had not even been born in 1992 felt the weight of the injustice, felt the urgency of resolution. And in that pressure cooker of expectation, the investigation reached its most dangerous phase, the point where one misstep, one overlooked detail, could collapse everything. The suspect, sensing the walls closing in, began to talk, not in confessions, but in riddles, in half-truths, in carefully chosen fragments designed to mislead, to delay, to confuse, and each interview became a psychological battle, a chess match played across decades of memory and denial, as detectives tried to coax clarity from a mind that had spent a lifetime constructing lies. And although progress was slow, something crucial began to emerge, a pattern of movement, a trail of locations, a final destination hinted at but never fully revealed, like a ghost path leading toward a place no one wanted to imagine. And then, late one night, as rain lashed the windows of the precinct and exhaustion blurred the edges of reason, a single name surfaced, whispered almost involuntarily, a location far beyond the city limits, a stretch of land so remote, so unremarkable that it had escaped attention for decades. And in that moment, the entire investigation pivoted, its momentum shifting from urban labyrinths to open, desolate terrain, from alleyways and warehouses to forests, fields, and forgotten roads, where the earth itself might still hold the answers everyone feared. As search teams prepared to mobilize, the city held its breath, suspended between hope and dread, because whatever lay ahead, whatever truth waited in that distant place, would not only define the fate of one lost girl, but would reshape the story of Chicago's darkest chapter, exposing wounds long concealed, and forcing a reckoning that no one, not even those who had chased the case for 30 years, was truly ready to face. And in that charged silence, as engines idled and lights cut through the rain, one thing became terrifyingly clear. The cold case was no longer cold, and the truth, once stirred, would not rest until it was finally, completely, devastatingly revealed. The convoy rolled out before dawn, headlights carving pale tunnels through the rain-soaked darkness, engines humming with restrained urgency, as if even the machines sensed the gravity of what lay ahead. And miles beyond the city's dying glow, the landscape flattened into endless fields and skeletal trees, a silent expanse where secrets could be buried for lifetimes. And with every mile marker that slipped past, the tension inside each vehicle thickened, because the name the suspect had whispered had not pointed to a house, or a warehouse, or a storage unit, but to a forgotten stretch of land, a place so remote it had never earned a proper address, a scar on the map known only to hunters, trespassers, and those who wished never to be found. By the time the sun rose,
Its weak winter light revealed a patchwork of muddy roads and half-collapsed fences, the remains of an old agricultural tract abandoned when the factory it supplied shut down in the late 80s, leaving behind rusted machinery, sagging barns, and acres of unclaimed soil. And as the search teams fanned out, their boots sinking into cold earth, every step felt like a trespass into someone else's nightmare. Because here, in this quiet isolation, the city's worst fears might finally take shape. The first anomaly appeared near a shallow depression between two dying trees, where the soil's texture shifted, compacted unnaturally, as though something heavy had once pressed into it, and ground-penetrating radar confirmed the disturbance, its ghostly image forming on the monitor like a submerged wound. And when the shovels went in, the air changed, thickening with a metallic tang that no one needed to identify. A smell that bypassed reason and spoke directly to instinct, and within hours, fragments of bone emerged, weathered but unmistakably human, each piece a silent accusation, each fragment a confirmation that the past had never truly let go. Work slowed to a painstaking crawl, as forensic anthropologists documented every centimeter, every shard, every trace of fabric clinging to the remains, and as the excavation expanded, more bones surfaced, scattered, incomplete, as though time itself had tried to erase them, and the realization struck with brutal clarity that this was not a single grave, not an isolated act, but a dumping ground, a place chosen for its emptiness, its invisibility, its capacity to swallow horror without protest. And in that moment, the cold case exploded into something far darker, far more vast than anyone had prepared for. The media gathered at the perimeter, their cameras capturing only blurred figures and flashing lights, but their speculation raced ahead of the facts, fueling public dread. And back in Chicago, families glued themselves to screens, searching each update for a hint, a clue, a promise of closure, while investigators labored under the crushing weight of expectation, knowing that every fragment they lifted from the soil might belong to someone who had waited decades to be found, someone whose name had been whispered into the dark by loved ones who never stopped hoping. As the dig continued, personal items emerged, a rusted watch frozen at a single moment in time, a bent key, a fragment of denim, each artifact a story interrupted, and when one piece of jewelry was uncovered, a small silver pendant engraved with initials, detectives felt a collective shudder, because it matched the description of the one thing the 1992 victim never removed, a keepsake from her mother, worn until the chain broke and the metal dulled, and in that quiet, devastated instant, the search crossed a threshold, transforming from investigation into vigil, from procedure into mourning. DNA testing would take weeks, but instinct screamed what evidence would soon confirm, that this land had finally surrendered the girl it had hidden for 30 years, and with that realization came an unbearable mix of relief and grief. Relief that the unknown had an answer, grief that the answer came wrapped in such irreversible finality, and as the teams continued to dig, uncovering more remains, it became impossible to separate individual tragedies from the collective horror, because the site revealed itself as a cemetery of the forgotten, a testament to how many lives could vanish when silence became the norm. The suspect was brought in for renewed interrogation, confronted with photographs of the excavation, the artifacts, the bones, and for the first time, his defenses collapsed entirely, his body sagging under the weight of undeniable proof, his voice trembling as he began to speak, not in grand confessions, but in broken fragments, half-sentences that tumbled out like debris after a collapse. And through those disjointed admissions, investigators pieced together a narrative of predation, opportunity, and calculated cruelty, a life spent circling vulnerability, exploiting trust, and vanishing back into the anonymity of a city that had never noticed his absence. He spoke of night drives, of watching from across the street, of learning routines, of waiting for moments when fear and fatigue dulled awareness, and although he avoided explicit detail, his words painted a portrait of methodical patience, of crimes committed not in frenzy, but in chilling calm, and with every admission, the weight of the past pressed heavier upon the room.
until the air itself seemed to vibrate with the accumulated sorrow of decades. The revelation that others had been involved surfaced slowly, reluctantly, as if even he feared the consequences of naming them, and although many of those men were long dead, their shadows lingered in old records, in financial trails, in the fragmented testimonies of aging witnesses, and as investigators chased those leads, they uncovered a network that thrived on silence, on mutual complicity, on the shared knowledge that exposure meant mutual destruction, and in that web of fear, countless crimes had been concealed, their victims reduced to statistics, their families left to wander endless years of uncertainty. Public outrage erupted as the scale of the atrocities became clear, protests filling city streets, demands for accountability echoing through council chambers, and questions aimed at every institution that had failed to connect the dots, to recognize the patterns, to act before time itself became the accomplice. And in that reckoning, Chicago was forced to confront not just the actions of a single man, but the systemic blind spots that allowed him to operate, a collective failure that spanned decades and generations. Yet amid the fury, there was also a fragile sense of vindication, a belief that the dead were finally being heard, that their stories were no longer trapped in forgotten files, and as families gathered near the excavation site, lighting candles, leaving flowers, whispering names into the wind, the land itself seemed to bear witness, its once silent fields transformed into a sacred ground of remembrance, a place where grief and truth finally intersected. For the family of the 1992 victim, the confirmation was both devastating and merciful, an end to decades of wondering, of imagining every possible fate, of living suspended between hope and despair, and although no discovery could restore what had been taken, the knowledge that she had been found, that her story would be told, that her name would not vanish into the margins of history, offered a slender thread of peace, one they clung to with trembling hands. But even as the investigation surged toward resolution, unanswered questions lingered, shadows that refused to dissipate, because the suspects' fragmented confessions left gaps too vast to ignore, hints of locations yet undiscovered, of victims yet unnamed, and the possibility that the excavation site was only one chapter in a much larger saga, and in those unanswered spaces, dread coiled, reminding everyone involved that closure is rarely complete, that justice often arrives scarred, imperfect, trailing the echo of what can never be undone. As the winter days shortened and the excavation drew to a close, the land was sealed, its coordinates logged, its soil carefully restored, but nothing could erase the knowledge of what lay beneath, and as the convoy returned to the city, the silence inside the vehicles was profound, each investigator lost in private reckonings, each burdened by images they could not unsee, and in that heavy stillness, a single truth resonated with devastating clarity. The cold case had been solved, but its solution had opened a wound far deeper than anyone had imagined. And as the first court dates were set, as indictments were drafted, as the machinery of justice finally began to turn, the city stood on the edge of a reckoning that would not merely close a file, but redefine its relationship with the past, forcing a confrontation with decades of buried pain. And in that charged, fragile moment, the story of 1992 reached its penultimate breath, poised on the brink of final revelation, where the full weight of truth, confession, and consequence would soon collide, leaving nothing unchanged in their wake.